Hello, are you here to debate? Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, are you here to debate?
Yes.
All right, what's your name and how old are you?
My name is Kurt Smith, and I'm 57.
All right, what are you here to talk about?
Well, actually, you were just talking about basically socialism replacing capitalism. I don't know that I strongly disagree with you, but I think the outline that you just made is a little simplistic, because there are always questions such as who would then control the issues of production. Somebody needs to be in charge.
Yeah, the workers typically would vote in a chair or a representative for themselves. This representative would make certain decisions. Other decisions would be left up to company-wide votes, kind of similar to the way unions will vote on like new union contracts. And they'll like have a union rep who will go in with their interests in mind, and this union rep can be removed pretty much at any time if there are issues. So there would be stipulations that the workers can use to remove anyone if they're not vying for their general interests.
Well, here's kind of my problem with that kind of a system. See, my father and my stepfather worked in the steel mill when it was highly unionized in Pueblo, Colorado. There's a steel mill there that's now closed down. That's where they both worked. And they had a union there. They both tell me the same stories about voting in those union reps, how they would call a union meeting with free beer. And after everybody was good and liquored up and gave a rah-rah speech, they would vote for the union to strike. And then the union reps would go to Chicago and stay in very nice hotels and negotiate the contract, while most of those workers sat back in Pueblo eating beans and rice.
Sure. Do you believe that the anecdotal stories from like your father and grandfather are indicative of like every union, or just the
that
unions
was my
that they
father
were
and
part
my
of?
stepfather? And
Sure.
yes, I've heard that story from several people, other folks who belonged to strong unions in the United States when unions were strong. Yes.
Do you think we shouldn't have unions then? Do you think unions do a greater harm than they do a good?
Absolutely not. I'm a strong believer in unions. As a matter of fact,
Okay.
we're not too far apart. I'm just not anti-capitalism. I believe that the real problem is that the system we currently have is socialism for the rich, i.e., that business is too big to fail, so we've got to bail them out. And capitalism for the rest of us.
I would just disagree that this is socialism. This socialism is a very distinct meaning.
Well, no.
So,
you didn't listen carefully. I said socialism for the rich.
Yes, I would still
in other words,
with this.
Capitalism for the rest of us. In other words, it's nice that government bails people out and helps people out as long as those people are already rich. That's the problem.
Yeah, again, I disagree with your assertion that it's socialism for the rich, because I don't view socialism as just like corporate bailouts, right? This isn't what I would argue that socialism is at all. I would just argue that this is capitalism at work. This is corporations lobbying for bailouts and money because they have the money to pay Congress and the Senate. This is corporatism, or like crony capitalism, like at work.
Well, we agree that that's a big chunk of the problem. How about that? What you want to call it is what you want to call it. But I'll give you that we agree that that's a big chunk of the problem. I'm just not sure that I guess what I truly would argue for would be capitalism, with probably most of the problems that I view as currently happening in capitalism would be solved if we just took the tax rates back up to and by tax rates, I mean business tax rates and tax rates on the wealthy, back up to what they were, say, in the 1950s, and then use that money to redistribute, essentially, and solve the problems you were talking about, such as crimes of the poor. Because, well, if we start eliminating their being poor, you're not wrong. I was a poor child. I stole. You know why I stole? Because they had it, I wanted it, and I didn't have it. Sometimes it was as simple as food.
Uh-huh. I think the thing that is missing here in my assertion is that capitalism isn't going to fix this, because part of the problem with capitalism is a global system. Capitalism only works for us here in like America when we're actively harming and killing people in other parts of the country, of the world. So the reason why capitalism works for us is because, well, we destroy the global south in order to maintain our resources and our expansion. I don't believe this to be a working system. Even if we're taxing the rich, it would still just be we're helping us. We're not helping the other people that are being devastated by global capitalism. So in this vein, what I would say is the only way that we're going to see any sort of change globally is a complete liberation of the working class.
Well, my problem with that is that most of the times that it's been tried, it didn't really, it essentially ended up being a corrupted system that was basically had exactly the same problems that you're describing.
I would disagree. I'd say the vast minority of socialist countries have fallen because of corruption. The majority of them have fallen because of imperialist interference, specifically from the United States.
Well, here's the thing. Mikhail Gorbachev, a agriculture minister from a poor province in Russia, who ended up being against the communist state because the people were starving to death, somewhat disagreed with you.
So there's a pretty big myth of starvation in the USSR. While starvation was an issue during the famines, by the end period of the USSR, by the middle to end, members of the USSR were eating basically the same caloric diet as people in the United States. They were also eating more nutritious diets than people in the United States. This is directly from a report by the CIA. Into when they were looking into diets in the USSR during the Cold War. So this idea that like people in the
it was a starvation.
What? Yes, you did.
No. What I said was that Mikhail Gorbachev was a agricultural minister from a out of the way province of, and maybe I misspoke. It could be. An agriculture minister from an out-of-the-way province in the Soviet Union, who became the premier and who viewed their standard of living as being below what most Western countries had. The exception, I believe, it really, okay, let me back off a step and make sure that I'm saying what I want to say, because like many of the Western democracies of Europe have a nice mixed economy where there are certainly some socialistic elements to it, but they're not anti-capitalism either. There's certainly, you can get rich in Western Europe.
I would say, what does this have to do? If we're looking at just an overall happiness index of the people there, when we look at the amendum, the amendum vote that happened in 1991, 80% of all, 71% of all people in the USSR voted to maintain the USSR. They didn't want the USSR to turn into a capitalist country. They didn't want that. They wanted to continue in the USSR. I would argue that that's indicative of people being happy in the system, right? If they're actively voting to stay in the system.
Well, the problem with that would be basis for comparison. You and I think, would agree that there's a whole set of Americans who think that on a regular basis vote for keeping no change in our system. And I really, in my experience, most of the problem with most of those folks is that they have no basis for comparison.
You think that people in the USSR in the 90s didn't have a basis for comparison to you? It was the 90s.
Yes, it was the 90s.
They knew it was post Cold War. Post Cold War, they knew about the U.S. The problem is by this point the capitalists in Russia had already come in like post USSR, pre-Russia, had come in and destroyed the economy with like shock therapy treatments, among other things. Right, the economy was decimated in the USSR by the U.S. and in internal capitalists trying to overthrow the socialist government.
So, as an example of the problems that they were in a transition time. By what I mean by that is that, just hear me out for a second here. I dated a Russian woman when I lived in D.C. a few years back, and her father was an academic. He had worked at a Russian university his entire life, and basically depended on the communists to take care of him when he got old. And unfortunately, he got old right there when the system changed over. And there wasn't a lot of fallback made for these folks that should have been taken care of, because they'd worked their whole lives and put into a system, and then that system disappeared. Well, go figure, her father and her, because of him, were a little discontented with that system at that instant. It's difficult to take an opinion at a transition point and say that, oh, they're against the system, which is basically the survey that you're talking about. It's right there in that period.
What? The reason why they wanted to maintain in the USSR is, again, because of the destruction capitalists brought to these countries. So yeah, they wanted to go back to the system that they had free food, free water, they were taken care of. That was the system they wanted to go back to, as opposed to the system that the capitalists had created, where they were starving and their money had been devalued to the point of basically nothing. Like, what do you mean?
I'm not sure that my comment was that unclear. However, like I said, what you're choosing a time. Okay, let's try a different way.
We're choosing the end of the USSR because the question was whether or not these people wanted to maintain their existence in the USSR. What other time would we use? We would use the end of the USSR to see if they want to stay in the USSR.
If we had a period with that set of people, so for example, Poland was just as communist as the USSR. However, I noticed that they haven't went back to communism. And Poland's probably a poor example because they were very forced into it. But Czechoslovakia, there's a whole set of other countries that we could look at that were part of the Soviet bloc and practiced communism that have not went back to it.
Yeah, I would argue in most of these cases, the reason these countries haven't gone back to communism, right, is because they weren't actually doing like communism when they left communism, right? They still had states, they still had classes. They weren't doing real communism. Communism can't be done on a country level. It has to be done on a world level. Were they doing socialism? Maybe.
No,
but typically what we see in these countries that were socialist, that leave socialism, we see an influx of capitalists pushing out propaganda to maintain their foothold. This is why the U.S. had a very large socialist party prior to the Red Scare, And then after the Red Scare, we found it. You're not going to find many major socialist movements in the U.S. because of the violence that the U.S. did to anybody that even remotely hinted at the fact that they might be communist.
Well, like I said, I don't necessarily think that we're as far off as you think. As far as on a world scale, you're not wrong. That's pretty much what Marx said. If you actually read anything that he wrote. It was not a proposal for a system to happen to part of the world. I started off on debating this. I can see that we have different viewpoints, and I don't necessarily think that your viewpoint, like I said, I don't think we're as far apart as you tend to think. I would not vote for a system that is going to go absolutely socialist. I believe that having some incentive is a great idea. And the problem with what you're proposing is, I believe it does not allow for the corruption that human beings bring into things. There has always been a certain amount of socialism in human society, and there's always been a certain amount of abuse of that.
I would argue that capitalism is the system that misuses human greed. That's why we get corporatism and crony capitalism, is because human greed is allowed to run rampant as long as you have enough money.
Well, and see, that's why my view on much of current America is that we have not properly applied the lessons that we should have learned in, say, the early 1900s. We applied them for a period, and that period has passed, and we just need to reapply them and the world to come back around.
Lessons such as what?
Well, like I said, if you allow too many persons that are too wealthy without basically taking a big chunk of that wealth away from them and redistributing it, then you end up with a situation where they have enough money that they can corrupt the political system, and that changes it into a system that becomes, like you said, crony capitalism. We agree that that's the system that we have now.
This is the critique of capitalism that is the Marxist socialist critique. The critique is that capitalism will always lead to crony capitalism and corporatism. There's no way around that. There's no way around this, because the rich will always influence politics with their capital.
Well, thus, the lesson that's been learned is to take away a chunk of that capital.
But how can you take away a chunk of the capital when they're influencing the people who make the decisions about how much of the capital to take away?
Well, it does become more difficult, but we've managed to do it in the past, and I believe we can do it again by a large enough uprising of the people.
So an uprising, what are we going to like? How do you
No,
view this?
not an armed uprising, nothing like that. I merely mean an exercise of democracy.
Okay, how so? Give like an example of how you would do this.
Well, again, in the early 1900s, the system resembled strongly what we have today, and with an uprising of democracy and people voting in wise ways for their own interest, and a few brave politicians, we created a much better world that was there for a good 30, 40 years, 50 years. We strongly increased the taxes on the wealthy, monopoly laws, things of that nature. I mean, yeah, I think you can see where I'm going.
How do you implement that all today when, again, the people who make these decisions are bought out by massive corporations and like PACs? How do you make those decisions? How do you do that today?
Well, you do it, hopefully, by educating folks, and so that again they, instead of the problem today is that we have a whole set of people who are voting essentially against their own interest, and if we hopefully could educate them, which I think that's probably kind of one of the purposes of your program, then we could get them started more in voting in their own interest. Part of that would be just educating them. Most Americans today have never read a book. If you can't tell, I've read a few.
Can you point me to any major politician that's not backed by a political PAC that may be a conflicting interest?
Ooh. Any major politician?
Yeah.
Probably not. It's not, again, I'm just, let me ask you a question. How do you see us going from where we are today? Because you're asking me, do I have all the answers? I don't. But how do we go from where we are today to a much more fair and even system like you're proposing?
So there's a few ways. I believe we need to do it. There needs to be either a mass worker protest in which we refuse to work until the means of production are given over to us by the corporations, right? We quite literally refuse to make them money, whether or not their businesses fold over or not. Or there's like a genuine armed uprising of the proletariat, which is the Marx kind of, well, not the Marx, but kind of like the traditional Marxist view of how this is going to happen. We're going to hit a tipping point in which people decide to fight back against the people that are in control.
Well, I guess my problem with either of those two scenarios is, one, there's, for the essentially armed uprising, there, in those situations, one, for it to actually implement the system that you're pointing out, you would need to have that happen on a worldwide scale all at once. That would take an awful lot of coordination.
Not for socialism. For communism, yeah. But communism isn't meant to be. I don't believe we're going to hit a communist revolution by an uprising. I think communism is going to come naturally once we implement socialism, when we give the workers the means of control. Then we will naturally fall into a communist system.
Again, so the question becomes, because here's the thing, I'm not opposed to the idea of worker control. However, you still have to guard against corruption in that system.
Yep, corruption happens now, yeah. Any system can be corrupt. Any system can be corrupt, but that's not a reason not to go with that system, right?
Well, yeah, we agree on that. I did say not that would be against that system, but we certainly need to guard against that corruption, because essentially that's what really has done away with that's what did away with the communist states, is what I'm trying to say.
No, the bulk of states that tried to democratically move to a socialist system were destroyed because America intervened. Specifically, like when we look at Latin America, most Latin American states tried to become some form of socialist or communist, but then America would come in and have violent uprising or coups or things like that. Like when we're looking at failed communist states that like the USSR or China, sure, but these are not the bulk of examples of communist states that failed.
Which South American states specifically are you referring to?
Chile, Honduras, Nicaragua, Haiti, Venezuela, Cuba. Like how many Puerto Rico? Like we intervened in so many. Like they're like look at Operation. Look at like Operation Contra with Reagan. Look at the coup in Chile with Pinochet and Allende. Like we intervened in like all of these places.
See, I'm not sure. Okay, well, let's take Venezuela as an example. we really didn't cause the problems in Venezuela. I disagree with you there. But here's the thing. The problems in Venezuela are not the problems that most U.S. conservatives would say that they are. The real problem with Venezuela is they went to a point where their entire economy was based upon oil, and then they didn't have the oil money coming in anymore. And
yeah, sure, but this isn't looking at what we did prior to all of this, right? In 2002, the United States quite literally instilled a coup. We killed a bunch of the civilians in Venezuela. We kidnapped Chavez, and then the Venezuelan people like forced us to return him. Like, so this is like ignoring all of this. I'm going to be honest.
I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm a little ignorant of that time period and Venezuelan history, honestly, South American history. But we have certainly always been guilty of imposing our will on and more or less unwilling South America. So that's been a flaw for a very long time. So I'm not going to say that you're wrong because I'm a little ignorant. So I'm going to concede the point to you.
Yeah, then I would just say then at that point, again, we're just back to socialism not failing because of socialism failing because of capitalism, typically.
Well, as I said, I am not the anti-socialist guy. I'm a believer in a more mixed system than you are. I tend to believe that human greed is going to play a part. Socialism.
I just want to point something out when we're looking at like leftist political or leftist economic ideologies. Socialism is the mixed system, right? Communism wouldn't be socialism is the system that is mixed with. You're allowed to make your market still exists. Jobs still exist. Money still exists. This is the mixed system. Communism would be the complete.
I started out this conversation by saying that I don't think that we're really that far apart. And it sounds like what I hear you saying is, and maybe I was a little less than perfect with my terminology, but it sounds like you're coming to the place where, and maybe I'm the one who's coming there, where we're really not that far apart. Really, can I ask you about another one of your issues that you have listed up here?
Sure.
And I'm sorry. Basically, I'm going to concede that I'm going to say that we're not. What you're proposing is probably pretty close to what I'm proposing. Maybe our terminology is a little different, and I'm going to concede that we agree more or less on the economic issue. When you mention the pro-choice for all 9 months.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of curious, is that exactly what you mean?
The position of pro-choice on all 9 months is just saying that at any point during the pregnancy, somebody can remove a fetus. Whether or not they remove that fetus harmfully is kind of dictated by a sentience principle. So I believe at 24 weeks, when the fetus has the capacity for sentience, we shouldn't remove it. We should remove it in a way that would prioritize the life of the fetus.
Okay. And thank you for clarifying that answer, because that makes a difference to me. Quite frankly, again, I don't think you and I are that far apart. Basically, when somebody tries to tell me that a blastula is a blastula, I don't know how biologically up you are, but that's a little ball of cells before implantation. When somebody tries to tell me that equals a human being, I'm not sure that I agree with them at all. So, okay, actually, you know what? I'm not going to debate you on that because I'm not sure we're that far apart. I don't know that I would take it clear until 24 weeks, but it's a real fuzzy area. So actually what I'm probably going to do is ask you about a few other things, because I'm kind of curious of your standpoint. Mostly, I've seen your program on here a few times, and mostly it seems to be a pretty together kind of a program. When you talk about gender affirming care for minors, could you elucidate your position there?
Yeah, the position on gender affirming care for minors is basically saying that anybody who needs gender affirming care, depending on not dependent on age, should be able to receive gender affirming care. It should be commensurate with their developmental stages. So, for instance, we wouldn't do things involving hormones until around Tanner stage 2. But if there is a need for social affirming care, we do social affirming care. It's basically just saying care should not be limited because of age, because there's no clear evidence on that being a negative impactor of.
You just gave me a couple of pieces of information about you. One, you're pretty well informed because you know what Tanner stages are. And two, you would do it at Tanner stage 2. You would allow hormones?
Pubertal suppressants and hormone replacement therapy. Yeah, that's when you start producing those hormones en masse, which is when we would allow.
I'm aware of that. I'm not sure. We're not so very far apart, but I'm not certain that I would allow hormones at that point. Not because I believe that the right-wing rhetoric that they're going to do any real harm, but mostly because I'm not entirely convinced that a child at that stage is mature enough that I feel like they've actually can make that sort of a decision. My daughter, who's now 30 and a very happy young woman, was still pretending to be a cat sometimes when she was starting on Tanner stage 2. So, because she had breast buds, and so I'm not sure that I agree with how early you are. I don't think that our differences, again, are going to be so wide that it's probably going to interest other people to have those minor debates. So I'm probably going to leave it alone. I was just curious what your position was.
Yeah, I would just make the argument that it's not the kids making the decisions. It's parents and doctors making those decisions. And I think parents and doctors should be allowed to decide the best medical treatment for their children, separate of any like governmental interference, especially when we found that there to be no real harm done by allowing for gender affirming care.
Well, I'm quite certain, I agree with you that there's no physical harm done by that care. I wonder where you come to a point where, again, my daughter was in Tanner stage 2, and she was still pretending to be a cat sometimes.
Yeah, but the difference here is she would be pretending, right? Children who have gender dysphoria and or children who are trans, they're not pretending. And that's why, per the WPATH model, we need to see a 6-month persistence in their gender dysphoria before we'll even give them a gender dysphoric diagnosis. I think you can tell when a kid, I think kids are really bad at like upholding a lie for 6 months. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And again, it's not a subject that I'm an expert on. At least one point that you made, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that. When you say that their parents and their doctors are making decisions about their health care, in modern America, quickly as we move into the teenage years, which, you know, Tanner stage 2, we're talking maybe 12, a couple of years later, we've moved right along. And quickly we come to a point where parents are wisely, parents are much less involved in their children's healthcare decisions. And I say that both as somebody who's involved in healthcare and as a parent of two daughters who grew up quite well. And so I believe that statement doesn't allow for as much choice of the children as there should be, but that's a minor debate. I just think we're looking at.
Do you think that doctors would perform gender affirming healthcare if the child says they don't want to do it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, no. I do think that there's a certain amount of. Okay, so we won't go into details here, but I'm an older guy, but I dated a woman who was considerably younger than me a few years ago, who started out our introduction by saying, I'm a lesbian, right? My point is that she was 19 and her sexuality and or gender identity was not entirely solid at that point.
Was not entirely solid at that point. What do you mean her gender was not solid?
Even normal. What I'm saying is, so I myself am a heterosexual white male, if you can't tell. And anybody who meets me or knows me tells me it's pretty obvious when we start. Now, I quite frankly don't tend to place my sexuality on other people, and I don't want to decide anybody else's sexuality for them. And quite frankly, as long as you're not looking in my bedroom windows, I'm just as happy not looking in yours. That all being said, when I was 19, and probably you could infer that if it happened when I was 19, then it certainly happened when I was 13. I was not nearly so certain that I was a heterosexual male. And I'm suspecting that that's not true of only me, that a lot of people up and through their early 20s, at least, are a little uncertain of their sexuality. So if they're a little uncertain of their sexuality and they're in a home environment where some of the people are certain of their sexuality, but it's not the quote-unquote norm, it's not heterosexual, that they could be influenced towards that sexuality, so that what they tell their doctors may not be what's true for them 20 years from now.
I just don't understand what sexuality has to do with their gender.
Well, same thing. It's really their sexuality, their gender, any of those socially assigned roles could be influenced by their socialization by their parental units.
Except we have like overwhelming evidence to show that your gender identity isn't really something that can be influenced. We can see this when we just look at the David Reimer case, where they tried to like force him to live as a girl.
David Reimer.
So David Reimer was a child who had a botched circumcision, and then his therapist and parents decided to raise him as a girl. But he never once believed he was a girl. He didn't feel like a girl. Didn't matter. They never told him that he was born male, right? Because he didn't have male genitals in the way that we do. So they never once. They just said, "Oh, you have a messed up down there from a surgery," right? Never once told him he was a male. It didn't matter, right? He believed he was a boy. He knew he was a boy, and he couldn't be influenced no matter what. Like, it didn't matter what they said. So I think this is like very heavy proof that like we can't really influence someone to a different gender ideology. Some people may end up confused when just because they haven't thought enough about their gender, and maybe they just don't have the words and the language to accurately describe what it is. But the way we combat that is just with proper education. Like if we have a comprehensive sex education class, we can teach children like the differences between gender and sex, how to properly identify your gender, the feelings you may be having with said gender. Like, we can go through all of this, and then there won't be that confusion.
Well, I don't disagree with you about the education. I think that's a pretty solid idea. I think that the idea of, unfortunately, that's spot in our society pretty heavily, and I think that's ridiculous. But so we're on the same page with the education. As far as and I forget the name that you gave, David Rimmer, is that correct?
David Reimer, yeah.
Reimer, okay. I'm sorry, I just wasn't familiar with the thing. It's honestly not an area I traverse into that much. It hasn't touched my life. For better or for worse, it just doesn't touch me personally, so it's not an area that I venture into that much. But that particular case, as you described it to me, just with that minor amount of education, it begs some questions that you kind of glossed over. So there's much information that his parents may or may not have given him. I don't know. Again, I'm pretty ignorant of the thing. But there's indications that you can give somebody that what you're speaking is not the whole truth without saying, well, what I'm telling you isn't the whole truth. As maybe many of us who are observing current politics can testify. And the old but true story of the horse that could quote unquote count, and he was actually taking subconscious cues from his master. That child, I promise you, your children take subconscious cues from you all the time. Mine certainly did as a parent. It was my greatest joy that my children grew up to do not as I said, but very much as I did. Luckily, when they were watching, I did most of the right things.
Yeah, I would just argue that this is totally speculative, right? There's no way to prove that he knew. I mean, I would argue he didn't know anything, hence why he killed himself, right? I think it's speculative to assume that he must have known something was up. He didn't know anything was up. This was the issue. His parents lied. His parents and doctors all lied to him.
Just curious here, and I'm gonna have to go look this up when we get done. But did you just say that he ended up killing himself?
Yes.
Well, that sucks.
Yeah.
You know what? Been hugging your time here. By the way, you have a great program. Like I said, I just on YouTube Live, I've run into you several times and listened to what you have to say. You seem to be an intelligent man who doesn't quelch debate and has some intelligent things to say. So this is me. That's me applauding you, even though, and I don't think you and I are as far apart as maybe some other folks that you talk to. But I'm going to get off of your thing. Probably go look up David Bremer and write a paper that I need to write for my PhD that I'm really goofing off and putting off. You have a great night or a great day, whatever it is where you are. And if you get a chance, go out and see the eclipse. You have a good day.
All right, you too.